Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strohan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Welcome to today's episode. Joining me are two people here who I shall introduce shortly, Alex Wood and Matt Horne. Firstly, Alex is a convicted ex-fraudster, ex-conman, including some involvement in complex 50 million cyber-enabled frauds, and also, interestingly, impersonating the Duke of Marlborough, I think is the particularly interesting story there, in pursuit of a lifestyle that was perhaps out of your means at that time. We will no doubt touch on that more later. Alex sits here now, a reformed individual, and today he's a counter-fraud consultant and CEO of Reform Courses, dedicated to preventing financial crime. Now, our listeners are a diverse group of people, all interested in the world of intelligence, investigations, a shared interest in global security matters, and generally making the world safer. So on this podcast, we aim to speak to people who have a unique insight into this world. We certainly have that with you, Alex, and we're looking forward to that. This should be interesting to listeners for a number of key reasons. Firstly, to understand, to gather insight and understanding from a reformed criminal, to put ourselves in your shoes, to get a feel for your motivations and your state of mind. I think that's going to be really interesting. Secondly, to gain some tactical learning. So I brought along a colleague, Matt Horne, Director of Intelligence and Investigations, ex-Deputy Director at the NCA, and someone who spent a career bringing criminals to justice. So we're going to have a bit of a fireside chat around the cat and mouse games that occur during an investigation and prior to an investigation. So welcome, Matt. Thank you for joining us. Thirdly, to improve our resilience. So we're hopefully going to learn a bit around fraud prevention. It would be great if we can come away with some actionable insights to help our own individual resilience and that of the organisations that we represent and work for. So welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. It's amazing to be sitting next to someone like Matt.
Yes, yeah.
Not across a table in an interview room.
Exactly. You've had slightly different paths, it would be fair to say, during the course of your lives, although converging a little bit. Okay, so just to orientate both of you and also our listeners, we have a consistent format for the interview. Firstly, we kick off with the same question, which explores the path you chose. Secondly, we get into the main area of the conversation. I've alluded to a bit of it already, and then we ask the same question to all of our interviewees, which is we ask you to transport yourself to 2030, bring out your crystal ball, and make some predictions about where your domain will be at that point in the future. So if that all sounds okay, we're going to kick off. The pivotal moment that ultimately led to your chosen path. Now, with you, this may be multifaceted, because we kind of understand a little bit from our pre-conversations, but perhaps you could talk us through that, Alex, and then also the moment that led you to understand the impact that technology would have within that journey.
Yes, absolutely. So there were two real turning points in my life. The first from a legitimate life into criminality, and then the second from criminality back into legitimate life. So my whole childhood and sort of formative years were as a violinist, and I was a sort of child prodigy on the violin, and won scholarship to the Royal Academy of Music when I was very, very young. I think I was 13, which is quite unusual. Played all around the world, played for the Queen several times, and had a really successful childhood. And then I was at the Royal Academy of Music when I was about 23, and I was starting to earn a lot of money. I was doing recording sessions, playing soundtracks like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, that sort of thing. Earning good money, and suddenly developed repetitive strain injury in my wrist, which had the impact that over the course of about 3 months, my bowing arm, my right wrist completely seized up, and I was unable to play.
And could you, if someone brought you a violin now, could you kind of
Yeah. Have you got one?
give it a go? No, I should have thought of that, shouldn't I?
Yeah. Think ahead.
Yeah.
So I had this. I mean, looking back now, it wasn't a reason to go into fraud. I should have retrained. I should have gone into perhaps teaching or something. But I had a reasonably expensive lifestyle. I had an expensive mortgage. Because I was regularly earning sort of £15,000, £20,000 a month in recording sessions, which is great for a 23-year-old.
That's good money.
It's a lot of money.
Any learnings for musicians? Listening to this.
There is money in it.
Yeah.
So I suddenly had no income, and that's when I committed my first fraud. And if I look at that now through the eyes of a sort of counter fraud expert, I can understand that fraud by reference to the fraud triangle. So, like, the incentive was, I was pretty screwed for money. The opportunity was I could steal it, and then I could justify it, rationalise it by saying, well, if I hadn't done that, I'd be homeless, right? So that we'll come on to later frauds which can't be understood with that. So I set up a completely bogus company. Got friends of friends to invest in it. I think I took £50,000 in investments, and that just paid for my mortgage for a few months. And they reported me to the police when they realised it was a big scam. And I think it took City London Police about half an hour to unravel it. It was a very, very crude scam, and I went to prison for that. And that's so that was the first turning point. Is the inability to make a sort of honest living in the way that I'd planned for my entire childhood. So then I sort of became a criminal. So I met other criminals in prison, other fraudsters, and there was a sort of trend of my frauds getting more and more serious. And then obviously the last fraud, which you're aware of, was a multi-million-pound cyber fraud, as you've alluded to. So that was the first turning point. And to get back to your question, the second turning point was back into legitimacy. And that occurred, I remember, I think it was the 12th of July 2018, and I was standing to be sentenced at Blackfriars Crown Court, which is now, I think it's a block of flats now, but it was a sort of fraud court for London. And a common part of somebody being sentenced is that if there's a victim that's been particularly hurt, they'll read a victim impact statement, and the prosecutor generally does that. So the prosecutor stood up and read this victim impact statement, and explained that the director of this company, who I'd stolen from his company £1.3 million during a sort of 40-minute phone call, when he realised that the next day I hadn't been calling from the bank, all the money in the account had gone, he wasn't going to be able to pay 40 staff. I think I think he eventually got reimbursed by the bank, but it took 6 months of legal action. So this guy had a stroke when he discovered all the money had gone, and hearing that, for me, sort of broke me. I don't think I was put on this world to make people have strokes. So that was the turning point back into legitimacy. And then a few months after that, my dad had a heart attack, and I blame myself for that. So those two things really gave me the second turning point. That's why I now do this. I don't do this for the money, I can assure you.
Yeah. And what about that sort of moment where around technology? Okay, if I'm going to be doing this, it's going to be a big friend to me. Yeah.
So when I was committing the cyber fraud, for example, I was using number spoofing technology, for example. So I was using an app to mask my real number and look like I was phoning from the bank. We used complex systems to identify commercial mule accounts. So we would research companies on, we'd look for flags on companies' house. We'd look at striking off notices in things like Experian and so on. So we were using legitimate tech to find potential vulnerabilities and then exploit them. So I was using a blend of tech to discharge a very, very powerful cyber fraud. And then tech eventually became my undoing, and the NCA, Police Scotland and the Met did a sort of very, very proactive investigation using a lot of tech to detect me and take me down.
Yeah, I think we're going to touch on that a bit in a bit. I think one of the things I certainly found fascinating as part of this sort of introduction that you're giving to us here is of course the Duke of Marlborough.
Yes,
which is perhaps a more of the light-hearted end of some of the crimes you've committed. Perhaps you could talk us through that briefly.
Yeah, so this was so I basically had been released from prison, found myself homeless. So in I mean, you may be aware, but when somebody's released from prison, there's often no provision for housing. I think you're given a discharge grant of £75. You know, if you think of somebody that's drug addicted, for example, they've got £75, nowhere to live. What are they going to spend that £75 on? You know, so I was in this very, very sort of parlous financial situation, and I was sleeping on a bench in Heathrow Airport, in Terminal 5, Heathrow Airport. And it turns out a lot of homeless people sleep in the airport because it's like, you know, it's reasonably safe. You've got charging facilities. There's showers around. You know, you can take care of yourself. It's better than sleeping on a bench. Yeah. So
thinking Tom Hanks in that.
No, absolutely, the airport. Yeah. So I was in this situation, and I was sort of scrolling on my phone looking for. I was on Booking.com or something. You know, there are other hotel sites available, but I was looking on Booking.com for like a hostel because I think I had £8 or something on me, and I was thinking I'd find somewhere warm for the night. And I think all the hostels were like £15 minimum, you know, these backpackers places. So I scrolled down the list, and I was sort of wistfully looking at, you know, the prices going up as I scrolled down the list, and got to Claridge's at the bottom of the list. I thought suite was, you know, sort of £1,000 a night or something. I was thinking, bloody hell, that'd be lovely. So I set up a fake Outlook account. I mean, it was really crude looking back at it, a fake Outlook account. And I realised that, so from my experiences in the music industry, I know that like VIPs will contact the VIP manager at a hotel to make a booking. They don't do it through the normal channel. So I found the VIP reservations manager's email at Claridge's and emailed them from this, you know, email account I just set up, purporting to be. I was saying I was a Duke, but I was emailing as the Duke's diary secretary, right? So I came up with this ridiculous name. I think it was like something like Quentin Bingham Smythe was the diary secretary's name. So I emailed Claridge's as this guy. Said, yeah, His Grace is thinking of coming to stay at Claridge's for the next sort of 5 nights. He normally stays at the Ritz. His usual suite is occupied, so we're happy to give you guys a try. The usual payment terms are 30 days on invoice after checkout, so you know you don't trouble His Grace for a card upon check-in, that sort of thing. And I was expecting a response, you know, either no response at all. You know, you should think an email like that is get blocked by the firewall, you know, but then or something rude back. And I was, it was just like just chucking a stone in the water and just see what happens, right? So within about 5 minutes, I got a response back saying, oh yeah, it'd be wonderful to welcome His Grace to our hotel. We can offer this suite, we can offer His Grace an upgrade. And it had worked. And so I turned up, the last email that I got from them, they said, yeah, the payment terms are fine, we won't trouble His Grace for a card. And they said, does His Lordship have any requests for check-in? You know, do people have like the rider requirements and so on? I was thinking, I can't really take the mix. So I thought, well, but I have to come up with something like, you know, a lord might do, right? So I said, yes, His Lordship would appreciate a couple of warm flannels upon arrival to sort of wipe the day away. And so I turned up. I sort of half expected there to be police officers. What were you wearing? So I was always quite smart. You know, I didn't look homeless. I didn't smell. You know, I was. I had clothes. You know, and I had a blazer, and I made myself look smart. And so I got the train from Heathrow to Green Park. I bunked the fare, walked to the hotel, and said, yeah, I'm. And I tried to say, oh, my office has booked a reservation, just so it didn't look like I was committing a fraud, just in case anything was, you know, on top. I was expecting to get arrested. Like I didn't think it'd work. So I walked in. They took me straight up to the suite. So VIPs check in the suite. You don't have to check in at the reception desk. Checked in the suite, and then the manager was standing there, and he had this silver platter with 2 rolled up flannels on it, steaming, like this sort of citrus vapor coming off them. And I thought, oh God, I've got to go through it now. I've got to go through with it. So I took one of the flannels and put it on my head. And the other one I put over my face and just breathed deeply in front of this manager. And then I was like, I've got to give him the flannels back. And I was sort of almost laughing under the flannel, I remember it. So I took the flannels off and I sort of dropped them back onto the silver platter. And he just walks off sort of almost backwards, like how you leave royalty, you know. So that, and then it just went on for 7 months. I basically hit every single 5-star hotel in London with this MO. And I was staggered that hotels weren't sharing data on this. Like there was no sort of hotel-wide intelligence or anything.
No.
I think Claridge's, you know, for example, wouldn't share data with the Ritz because they're quite happy. You know, if this guy goes and defrauds the Ritz, they're quite happy with that because it's a competitor. Right? They don't really care. So I was able to get away with it for 6 or 7 months until the police finally caught up with me. But it was pretty staggering way to live.
I think what a couple of interesting things with that. One is it reminds me of a parallel story around jewellery theft. So you know, you get sort of organised criminals who will monitor jewellery stores in, say, Hatton Garden or whatever international jewellery quarter, you know, and they scope out all the vulnerabilities and everything like that, and there's just limited collaboration between these exclusive jewellers, and you think, well, it seems strange, you know, that you shouldn't be interacting more. So I think that's that's a vulnerability that gets exploited in lots of different areas.
I think the other vulnerability that I exploited was each hotel's greed. So, and it sounds weird if you think, okay, well, why would somebody like Savoy or Claridge's be greedy? But they loved to think that they were stealing a VIP guest from a competitor, and they loved to think that they had this this Duke staying with them. I mean, and that completely blinded them to what would be a reasonable measure of security. They didn't. I mean, I was caught after 7 months because a hotel decided to Google me, right? But that didn't happen for all that time. They just accepted that they were getting this VIP in, they were stealing it from a competitor, and no need to check him out.
Interesting.
Really.
And another thing that jumps out to me from this is this idea, and we deal with it day in, day out, but in potentially different contexts. But it's just, if you get away with something, your behaviour escalates. And it strikes me that there's a lot of that in terms of, you know, you start with a sort of relatively unsophisticated thing, and you think, oh wow, I got away with that, and then, you know, you keep going, and then you spend some time in jail, you collaborate with some people who have perhaps had other experiences, and you develop your portfolio of crime techniques, and before you know it, your behaviour is escalating as your techniques are escalating.
There was certainly an element of that in prison. You'll find that fraudsters and white, called white collar offenders, so money launderers, fraudsters, they're seen as low risk offenders. They're not into sort of stabbing people. They're not into trying to smoke drugs in prison. So all the low risk offenders are kept on a, you'll know this, they're all kept on a wing, just on their own, and that wing might need 2 or 3 staff just to make sure nothing kicks off. But generally, that wing doesn't really need policing. And then so you have a main unit with all the gangs, all the people that want to kill each other, and there might be sort of 30 staff looking after those people. So fraudsters are left to their own devices, and inevitably you just talk about how you got caught, your love of money, your love of assets, what cars you had, what watches you had, and it's just all about, there's nothing by way of mitigation of future risk, and it's all about how we can plan inevitably, how can we do it next time and not get caught. Maybe we can team up together and come up with the perfect fraud.
In the corporate world, we call that a melting pot of innovation.
Yeah, exactly.
Just in the wrong context. But yeah. Okay, so what I would suggest now is we try and think about heading into the main part of our conversation and start talking, starting to touch on some of the specifics around the crimes you committed and how you exploited the technology. You've already touched on it a bit, but one of the things that we were going to do, I think, I'm looking up at the recording people here as to whether we can play a clip, an audio clip from the session.
On the assumption that it's a virus, I have to ask you, have you had any suspicious emails coming in recently? Okay. What I think we're going to have to do is completely suspend the gateway and get you on what's called a diagnostic session. That means that nothing can go in or out of the account. And because I've called you, we do just have to ID ourselves to you so that you're entirely happy that you're speaking to the bank.
So let's now move into the main section of the discussion. And we've already touched a bit on this, but could you perhaps touch on some of the specifics around the crimes you committed, how you eventually exploited the technology to pull off some of the fraud offences? Before this, we listened to a recording of you in the process of defrauding someone. But perhaps just talk us through some of those sort of techniques.
So the recording you've heard was my voice and the person on the other end of the phone that you can't hear for legal reasons, but he was the victim that had the stroke. Right. So that brief phone call resulted in a £1.3 million loss, which I made in the course of about an hour. And I did that by sort of blending the technology of being able to spoof a phone number, and then very, very deep social engineering. So I was utterly convincing that I was from the bank, that there had been an attempted fraud on this man's account, on the business account, and we need to understand why this has happened, and it could be a virus, for example. This was, at the time, in 2017, it's shortly after the WannaCry virus had been causing chaos and in the news, and I sort of suggested to the victim that maybe something like WannaCry has been involved here. So we need to check your systems there and make sure there's no viruses, potentially attempting to hijack your digital journey when you're logging into your banking system. So they were totally concerned about that. They could see the phone number. They trusted it from the bank. What I did then was give and this is very, very powerful, but give the victim an opportunity to opt out, and that's probably the most powerful tool that I had in my arsenal. But I'd say, right, if we're going to have to do some tests now. I'm going to talk you through them. It's very important that we do it now because you could be very vulnerable. If you're not entirely convinced that you're speaking to the bank, despite the fact that you know who I am, I've given you all my details, and those details I'd stolen off LinkedIn, so if they Googled this guy, it would come up and it'd be accurate. As a result of this, a lot of banks took all of their staff off LinkedIn, but that's another conversation. So I'd say, right, if hang up now if you're not entirely trusting what I'm saying, but we're going to need you to come into the branch with the usual computer that you use to log in, with a laptop, or bring the CPU from your desktop if that's the case, and we're going to have to do some tests in the branch. So I can arrange an appointment for you to do that now. So by doing that, I'd given the victim an opportunity to opt out, although it's a very inconvenient opportunity. But they're thinking, well, why on earth would a fraud, if this guy isn't legit, if he's a fraudster, what fraudster in their right mind would ever give a victim an opportunity to end the phone call? Fraudsters don't do that. So this was. And
has there been scenarios where people have taken that during your?
There had been people who.
So you just gone, damn that.
No, there had been people that turned up at the bank.
Oh right, okay.
Holding their laptop.
Right. Yeah.
And facing a very, very confused bank manager, like, why on earth have you come in with your CPU, or turning up? Anyway, but the vast majority would, at that point, because they haven't opted out, they've sort of subvertedly opted in. So we had this sort of psychological pact to proceed, as I call it, and from that point on, anything I asked them to do, they would do. So really complex social engineering. A lot of fraudsters will try to rush victims into making a mistake, accidentally paying £2,000 because you're in a rush. You're told there's a time limit on sorting this out. Fraudsters are trying to attack your account. 5 minutes to move it to a safe account. Do it now, please. And that's very traditional sort of pressure tactics that people associate with fraud. So I was taking the opposite approach and sort of developing a sort of consultative relationship with the victim. Like, we're solving this together. We're working as a team. We're trying to work out together what's happened, and it was very, very different to any fraud they might have experienced, and therefore very convincing. So then we'd get them to authorise these huge payments. We'd direct them to an area of the banking system, banking portal that they probably wouldn't use a lot. So we were targeting companies that we thought were intellectually vulnerable, as we call it at the time. We basically said companies that we think are thick. So we targeted companies in the trade sector, right? So the recording related to a demolition company. So these sorts of companies might have a few million quid in the account.
Less checks and
probably they have less sophisticated internal checks. We targeted the sort of companies that might be family run, and once a week somebody's aunt might come in to do the books and make the payments, and that was the perfect profile of a victim for us. So we weren't sort of going after the accountancy firms, the solicitors firms, companies like Clue Software. We weren't hitting companies like that.
And just of a certain size. You have to go. There's certain decisions you can't make. So I can't okay transactions. There needs to be multiple people and all this sort of stuff. So it's sort of finding that sweet spot. I suppose.
Exactly.
You don't want to spend a whole lot of time on someone who's only got 10 grand in the bank account.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if they had less than 50, we'd leave them alone. So we were making this very, very sophisticated, very, very ruthless approach, and exploiting vulnerabilities. So in this case, exploiting intellectual vulnerability, we see it a lot with charities now. People really hitting charities because they're working on the basis that the people in the charities might be volunteers. They might not have, a church charity could have £500,000 in for a new roof. In the account, and you just get one, person coming in once a fortnight, volunteer to do the books. So we wanted companies with decent amount of money in the account, but with pretty low security thresholds.
Okay, so before I perhaps think about bringing Matt in, just in terms of dissecting that sort of cyber fraud risk, is there anything else that you might want to just put on the table before we hand over to Matt to sort of say, well, how does this align with how law enforcement tackles it? Is there any other?
So I mean, I guess from a sort of law enforcement side, I mean, one thing which we were able to do very, very well. When I say we, myself and my co-defendants, there's only two of us doing this. I think when the police came through the door, they were expecting to find about 50 people, but it's just the two of us. We would mirror the banks and the police's own messaging, own counter-fraud messaging. So the police does a very good job, and banks do a very good job of saying, never give your PIN to somebody who calls up, never give your codes from your smart card reader, don't do any of that. The bank will never ask for that. So I was able to repeat that counter-fraud messaging. Fraudsters don't want your PIN or your codes from your smart card reader, they want the money, right, ultimately. So as long as they get that, they don't really need sort of security details. So that was a really powerful technique to mirror the bank's own messaging. And the other thing that listeners might find interesting was that one bank in particular, who I now consult for, but one bank in particular detected a very precise trait of our modus operandi. So they detected that we were creating bulk lists, like big batch payments, which you can pay multiple people just with one set of authorization codes rather than doing repeated chapses or faster payments. So we were creating new bulk lists to people that have never been paid before, and then it was going to be a substantial loss if that sort of thing was to start appearing on the system. So this bank in question developed a pop-up which would appear on the victim's login at the point that they were beginning to input amounts for these new beneficiaries that they'd never paid before, as long as it was a bulk list. So this pop-up would appear. Now, after about 3 phone calls, so the pop-up was a skull and crossbones, and it says, warning, has somebody just called you to ask you to do these tests, payments, or move money to a safe account? If you've just received a phone call, if that's why you're doing this, hang up and call us immediately, because it's probably a fraud. So I realised, so about 3 or 4 victims said, hang on, I've just seen this pop-up appear on my login, it says you might be fraud, so hang on, and they hung up, and I lost that opportunity to defraud them. So I realised at exactly which point during the transactional journey this pop-up was appearing. So I was then able to pretend to the victim that I was sending the pop-up myself. So I said, right, we're just going to test our internal systems. We're going to put in, a pop-up to protect you in the future. Just going to program that now. Can you just make sure you can see that pop-up appearing on your screen? It's going to appear now. So they were like, yes, I can see it. It's come through. It says you might be a fraud. So fine. Okay, great. If you just click X or the red X to just get rid of that pop-up, that's fine. We can move on with the test. So not only did the bank's attempt to disrupt me fail, I was able to use their attempt to protect their customers as a tool to further convince them that I was genuinely from the bank. So their attempt to disrupt the fraud actually assisted me in perpetrating it perversely. Right. So that was a particular feature.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, Matt, how does this methodology tally with your understanding of and experience of fraud and economic crime?
I mean, fascinating conversation. And we've spoken a few times, but it's interesting to get into this level of depth around MO and tactics and tradecraft and how you would have carried out these offences, and important that you're sharing that, actually, because it does help to target harden and to prevent, and for people to put in better strategies going forward, which is good. I mean, I've reflected on a few things we've been talking about, actually. One of them was you talked, Alex, about the research methods and the profiling, and I would almost, using open source tactics, using publicly available information to kind of build up an intelligence profile, for want of a better word, for targeting, for malicious targeting, for criminality. And just reflecting how that is, we talked a bit about technology and how technology plays into this, and there's just like a very interesting dynamic there between, again, a similar technique which is used very successfully for public good. It might be being used to expose things globally through open source research, through things happening in war zones or in different parts of the world, or is used in fact by investigators, by intelligence officers in whichever area they're working in, where they're trying to counter people like you when you were in your former life. I just think that's an interesting interplay between a tactics, like open source, as we call it in the trade, and how that kind of is not just being used for public good. Sometimes it's being used in a very different way. So I found that quite interesting. I thought also, when you've talked about the steps you were going down to convince, to build trust, to create credibility, and how I've seen that in other work that I've been involved with, perhaps not so much in some of the cases I've been previously involved with, may have been more in the investment fraud space. Yes. Slightly different scenario, but actually where, again, you would see in some of those investigations that where someone has invested their life savings and maybe even persuaded other people that they love and know to do similar, that when sometimes that is exposed as criminality, as fraud, there is no investment, there is no, this is all a shout, that often sometimes those victims have been so deeply manipulated, and you talked about the buying in piece, brought into the process, or have effectively been groomed, in another language you might use, to the extent where they're refusing to believe law enforcement is coming to them and saying you've been defrauded. No, I'm not. This is my investment. This is my investment. My investment guy. I just thought that was interesting.
We see it a lot with romance fraud. When a friend or family member might say to somebody who's been duped into a romance scam, they might say, well, look, are you sure this person isn't defrauding you? And they're like, no, it's not a fraud. This is my love. He's going to come and see me next month. We're in love. I'm just helping him out in the meantime. He's got some cash flow problems, for example. And they're so utterly convinced that is a genuine relationship, for example. So that's another sort of parallel there, and a parallel that I use to really control the victim, and so when I'd defrauded someone, when I'd got the money into the mule accounts, I needed probably around, or the money laundering guys needed about an hour to get it all cashed out, or moved overseas, or put into Bitcoin. It would take about an hour to cash out the proceeds. So £1.3 million would be completely dissipated in an hour. So I'd have to make sure that the victim didn't have contact with the bank in that time. So I'd stay on the phone, for example, so that if for an hour, just pretending to do other checks and keep them safe, but basically chatting rubbish whilst the money was cashed out. So I knew that if the bank tried to phone them and say, hang on, are you aware that this payment's just gone for £1 million, for example, to people you've never paid before, is that fraud? The bank might follow up proactively. So I knew that the line would be engaged for a start. But the other thing I'd do is I would give the victim like a 6-digit code. So I'd say, right, this is a PIN. if anyone phones you ever and says they're from the bank, ask for this PIN, because there are fraudsters out there. I was committing fraud, but I said there are fraudsters out there that might try to phone you. So I'll always ask for this PIN, and it's a random 6-digit PIN. They say, okay, fine, I've written that down. I'll ask the bank for that. So I knew that if the bank tried to phone them and disrupt the fraud, they wouldn't have the PIN, and the victim would hang up. Now, there was a scenario which I was telling Matt about earlier, but there was a scenario where I'd given a guy this PIN. He had a daily limit of from his business account of, I think it was £500,000, but he had several £1 million in the account, so we'd phone him on consecutive days and come up with a different story about why we're doing more tests on each day. But he knew his relationship manager. He'd known him for 10 years. His banking relationship manager. They'd had a tight relationship. They got on well. They'd been to the football together. It's a sort of high value client, and the bank liked to entertain him. And he knew this guy personally. The relationship manager was phoning this victim every day on his mobile, so a number he knew and recognised as being the relationship manager. And because the relationship manager didn't have the PIN to give to this guy was swearing at him and hanging up every day for 5 days. I think in the end, the relationship manager was so certain that this guy had been totally hoodwinked that he drove to the premises and took the card off him and said, "Look, sit down. You're being defrauded. Wake up, please." Like it was almost like he was under a spell. So that's an example of the level, that sort of complexity. We used to call it black magic back then, or like almost like voodoo. Yeah. Somebody's totally convinced that the fraudster is legit, and it's staggering.
There's a couple of quick questions on that. One, and I'll say them both. You might get both of them, but how did you learn and improve? Was it in prison speaking to fellow fraudsters, and also how did you create your money laundering network? I mean, how did that start in prison, or how did you just go about all of a sudden? How did you get to this place where you suddenly had an hour, and you had all these? How did that? Yeah,
it's like for £1 million, I think I would need about 80 mule accounts to clean it properly. So so how I improved. So when I was in prison for the Duke offences, I met some people that had come in for a massive APP fraud. There was like 6 or 7
being
authorised push payment. Sorry, right, so like when you phoned somebody up and convinced them to make payments. So they'd come in to prison whilst I was there for this massive fraud. And I was talking to one of the heads of that OCN, organised crime network, and he was saying to me, "Mate, you've done this Duke offence. You've got really no money out of it. You just stayed somewhere for free. You could do a couple. I'm doing a year more than you, but I've made millions." And they were saying, "Well, it's stupid. It's stupid fraud. Like, why not make loads of money?" And the problem there is the sentencing guidelines under the Fraud Act, which basically mean anything over £500,000, you're in the top category for sentencing. So your maximum 10-year sentence. People, plead guilty. I end up getting 7 on a guilty plea, for example, for a multi-million-pound fraud. So the Fraud Act, I think, was from 2006. Correct me, Matt, if I'm wrong. But I think it's from 2006, when £500,000 was seen as a staggering amount of money for a fraudster to steal. So whether you steal £500,000 or £500 million, you're always going to, you're not going to get any more for stealing £500 million than you do for £500,000, because the maximum is 10 years, right? So I was sort of thinking about that and thinking, okay, well, you say you plead guilty, you get 6 or 7 years. You then do half, which is 3.5 years, and you made millions of pounds. Most of that sentence will be in an open prison because fraudsters are seen as low risk. So it really isn't, it's not like making £10 million selling cocaine when you're going to get 25 years for it, and risk being shot along the way. It's very, very low risk. So I was talking to this group that came in. It's the group I ended up working with, and they'd stolen 113 million between sort of 6 of them, made a huge amount of money. But they were saying that how they did it was they'd phone a company up and get the convince them to give over their username and password for online banking, so the person could log in remotely and start authorising payments, and then come up with a reason why they needed a code from the person's smart card reader, and there might be a virus on the reader, for example. Just test it, put in your PIN, and give us the code. So they were doing this fraud. So they were sitting remotely and logging in remotely to the victim's account and then clearing it out. So the victim had no sight of what was going on. The banks then, when these guys were nicked, tightened that up. So if now somebody logs in from a different IP address to usual and starts trying to make payments, those would be blocked, and it would detect the IP address was not the usual one. So, talking to these guys, we realised that could be the end of that type of fraud, where you can clear a company account for millions of pounds very quickly. So I was thinking, right, well, how can we get around that? And I was thinking, okay, well, you have to come up with a reason why the victim has to make the payment from their computer, their normal computer, at their premises. So you either break into the premises and tie them up and make them do it. It's not my style. Or you come up with a very convincing story over the phone why they need to do it. So then that led to a spate of frauds where people were trying to convince people to move money to a safe account, for example. You've probably heard there's quite a lot of press about that at the time. And then the safe account thing, as it was all over the news, I was thinking, we can't do that. So that's why I devised the notion of somebody from the bank phoning up saying we need to do some tests. We need to do some sort of virus tests on your system. And that caused a massive problem for the banks, because the payments were coming out of the usual IP address. So it must be authorised properly, and so it was very hard to detect. So yeah.
And in terms of it creating this sort of money laundering network.
Oh,
so
the money laundering network.
You just plugged into that through.
Yeah.
Through
So my co-defendant. He a sort of fascinating story of his own. He came to the UK in the footwell of a lorry from Pakistan with the sole intention of hijacking the UK economy, and that was it. And the idea to make money and just send it home to Pakistan, and then maybe all of his family can one day move to Dubai, which I think they did. So he came. His knowledge of the UK. So I remember when I was in prison with him after we got arrested for the cyber fraud. We were sharing a cell, and it turns out the cell was bugged. Obviously, that's the only reason we were allowed to share a cell. But so we were sharing a cell, and I remember it was Harry and Meghan's wedding. So this was summer 2018, I think. And I said to him, "Look, that's Windsor," and the carriage was going through Windsor High Street. I think I said, "That's Windsor. Have you ever been to Windsor?" And he said, yes, I know Windsor. Yeah, we did a big cheque fraud at the Barclays on Windsor High Street. And it turns out his knowledge of the UK was entirely predicated on the frauds he'd committed in certain areas. Right. So he had this detailed knowledge of places around the UK because he'd been there to commit fraud. Yeah. But anyway, so he was the money laundering guy, and he had this massive network of different accounts that he'd taken over. And he'd taken over... So most of the accounts were student accounts, so they would send people to university campuses at the end of a course of study, so sort of May, June time after exams, and approach people who are about to leave the UK, so international students. So he'd identify these people and offer them sort of £500 for their account. They're thinking, great, 500 quid cash for doing nothing. I'm not planning to come back to the UK anytime soon. Yeah, fine, have the accounts. Absolutely no problem at all. So he'd take over all of these accounts from international students. And then we would, for like £1 million job, you can't put £1 million into student accounts. So we need commercial mule accounts. So so that's when we would monitor company's house for signs of distress, look at Equifax for signs of distress, and if we saw a striking off notice combined with a dip in somebody's credit score, it was probably a sign that the proverbial had hit the fan, and then there might be trouble on the horizon. So I would phone up the company director and say, look, it looks like you're in trouble. Don't give me an answer now, but we will buy your account for £10,000 in cash. Here's my number. Just let me know if that ever appeals to you. And it was staggering how many people a few months down the line, as things started to unravel, as they might have to pay their mortgages, they might have to pay their car, and they're facing bankruptcy effectively. How many people, and that's another vulnerability we're exploiting, is people's commercial exposure. How many people would phone me back and say, yeah, look, give us the 10k and we'll just say no more about it. And so then we'd take over the commercial mule account. So when the police were investigating this, they saw that £1 million was getting split between 10 business accounts, and they're thinking, well, how, what company directors are agreeing to take £100,000, and then within seconds, that £100,000 is siphoned off to 20 student accounts in 5k tranches, and then we would have people literally sitting in like a Costa coffee. So there's these money laundering hotspots like Hounslow, Ilford, Birmingham, these well-known hotspots. They'd be sitting in like a Costa Coffee or Starbucks with a pocket full of debit cards, waiting for a text to say, yeah, there's 5k in this student account, 5k in that student account. They then go into the branch or the Barclays or wherever with the card for that account. We would generally have somebody inside the branch that was known to these people, so somebody who was corrupt inside the branch in these hotspots. So they'd wait to go to that cashier and then try to withdraw the 5k from that card, and the cashier would agree to, for 100 quid a time, not do the full ID and V check. So they wouldn't properly check the person withdrawing the money, and they just say, yeah, the checks have been done on the system, and give them the 5k. Right. So it's a very, very complex, sophisticated money laundering network. And then at the end of the day, all of these couriers would meet the boss, hand over the cash and get paid their small cut, and then we would receive a suitcase full of £50 notes, and that was it by the end of the day.
Wow. I mean, that's eye-opening.
Yeah.
Okay. Please.
Just on some reflections there. So, we talked earlier about where does this chime with other things that are being seen, and I think that piece there around the potential for insiders to be potentially supporting and assisting with some of this is another area that we see and keep a close eye on, that kind of insider threat risk, but also the international dimension. You've described a scenario that involved potentially international students, but equally the money could easily be being moved across international borders, and we clearly see that a lot. I've had a lot of experience of working on those cases where, in fact, even the offenders may be sat completely somewhere else in the world, targeting into the jurisdiction. So that whole piece around international borders, the mobility of money that you've talked to, I think you mentioned cryptocurrency earlier, the potential for people to use things like cryptocurrencies as well to kind of try and obfuscate the channels of these movements of cash and money, and all of which present challenges around the volume as well, the sheer volume. And it's all around actually being able to respond to that complexity, to be able to work across borders, to be able to work with partnerships with other organisations, and to have be able to keep across the complex data that always comes from a case like this.
Yeah.
So we just on talking about money across international borders, we would launder through the Hawala network, which obviously you've come across the NCA. Hawala, it translates to the word trust in English.
From what language?
From Pakistan. I think Urdu, but it was a Pakistani founded network for moving money and conducting trade. I think it was founded in Pakistan around 1200 AD, so it's sort of 800 years old, this network. It's now banned in Pakistan, ironically. But what I think it was a massive source of terrorist funding. I mean, it's used to fund like IS and Al Shabaab and so on. And how it works, it's called the transferring money without money actually moving. So criminals in the UK, for example, would go to a Hawala dealer, or known as a Hawalader, and take their 100k, for example, that they want to move to Dubai. Hand over this money. It's normally like a bureau de change, but I've come across Hawala dealers in like chicken shops and so anything that can hold cash
and have an internet connection.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So you'd go in with this money. They'd give you a code, and you'd hand over 100k to the Hawala dealer. He'd make that 100k available, for example, from his counterpart in Dubai. Your contact would then be given the code that you'd give him. It's often like the code that you get on a £5 note, the long code on a note, and then the person in Dubai would be able to pick up instantly that 100k, minus the sort of 3% commission for the dealer. So it's completely frictionless. It's a quicker and more effective way of transferring 100k to Dubai than using the banking system. And then what happens is the Hawala dealers at the end of the month would settle up. So one might have sent £500,000 to Dubai. The Dubai guy might have sent 300k to London. So they just settled the 200k balance at the end of the month, and it's not always settled with cash. You often see transfer of assets. Ferrari or something or a house would change hands, and more we're seeing transfer of migrant workers. So we're seeing people changing hands to settle a hawala debt. So it's fascinating. So the criminals are able to move money frictionlessly and instantly across borders without actually putting it in a suitcase and trying to smuggle it over the border. You don't need to do that.
Old hat, by regards.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
I mean, and it's interesting because hawala wasn't set up as a criminal money laundering operation, but it just lends itself so perfectly to it. But there's been, it was seen as a legitimate way of conducting business for many, many years. And there was a coup in North Mali, I think 10, 15 years ago, where the economy basically collapsed, the banking system collapsed. And hawala was the only way that people could buy food. It was the only way that people could conduct any sort of normal business. So hawala was used as a lifeline, but it just has this ability to be exploited by fraudsters.
Yeah, fascinating. Right, okay, so should we move on to a specific case, get a bit specific? We talked about this earlier, so let's go into a real specific crime and specifically how it caught up with you. How you eventually got caught, what were the challenges there, and then perhaps we can hand over to Matt and sort of compare and contrast from sort of both sides of the fence.
Totally. So in relation to the cyber campaign, I was causing a massive problem for some banks in particular that were losing a lot every day. So I think they funded, as far as I'm aware from the court papers, they funded a investigation conducted by a very proactive investigation conducted by the Met Police, NCA, and Police Scotland, and Police Scotland because one of the banks is headquartered in Edinburgh. So you probably work out which one that was. But so we. What happened was the recording that you heard earlier in the piece, that was passed to the police. So this company that I'd phoned had call recording on their line, right, sensibly. So that was passed to the police. The police then said to all the UK banks, this voice profile has been committing a lot of fraud. Does this voice profile fit any of your customers' voice profiles? So obviously we know, for example, HSBC, my voice is my password. Every time we phone our banks, we generate a sort of voice imprint on their IVR platform that they record. And if you phone the bank, so if I was to phone your bank and ask for your balance now, and I got all your security details right, but my voice was different to usual, they would probably hopefully ask for more security questions, and they probably wouldn't allow me to do any payments from your account, even though I had all the details correct. And they'd say, look, the voice. So they measure the frequency of the voice, they measure the rhythm, they measure the clicks, how you talk, and this is a digital imprint of your voice. So, anyways, this imprint was passed over to the banks. I think so. I had a Barclays account at the time, and Barclays said, look, this voice imprint, it matches, of our millions of customers, around about 50 people could have this voice that bank with us. So the police had a reasonably easy job of looking at who these people were. Only one had just got out of prison for fraud, so they put me under observation, and a very, very complex sort of proactive observation. I was being followed all around the clock, and that's the point about observation. You simply don't know you're under it. I'm sure you'll agree, Matt. But yes, the police did a very sort of proactive and complex undercover investigation. And then first thing I knew about it was when my front door was hammered off its hinges and I was arrested. But yes, so it was that. It was the technology used to analyse my voice. It was the sharing of information between the banks, the police, and then back to the banks to really, it's sort of they had this powerful piece of intel, and then they developed that intel and shared it. Yeah,
I mean, it's one thing knowing you did it, which is, it sounds like fairly quickly they got to that point. Then it's another thing, I suppose, handing over to you then, Matt, is just, actually building a case and holding someone accountable.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few reflections on that. So we talked a little bit earlier about, some of the money laundering networks that connect to these kind of fraud offences of the type that Alex was being responsible for, and not just being used for fraud as bad as that is, because there are real victims that are being having lives ruined through that fraud. There is also other really harmful stuff going on there with with drugs trafficking, firearms trafficking, people trafficking, human smuggling, all of those kind of really serious crimes are very high harm crimes. So I think it's just important, first of all, to say actually, so that fraud offence could have, in some view, being viewed as a white-collar crime or something like that, could be viewed by some as victimless. We know it's not victimless. We've talked about that extensively. But actually, it's going through it's entering the same criminal money laundering networks that are sustaining terrorism, high-level organised crime, drugs trafficking, really dangerous stuff. But I think what I've also seen in the latter end of my career was that this recognition collectively around economic crime, of which fraud is a major part, becoming somewhat of a national security threat. This is not just a small thing to do with white-collar criminality. This affects the economy, it affects real people. And in particular with fraud, the need to really get organised and to get proactive. And that was something, it's obviously that's a journey from the point of view of law enforcement. They're on that journey. But I was certainly seeing real changes at the end of my career where the focus was increasing around fraud. And actually, we talked about, how do you get ahead of that? How do you identify who are the high harm offenders, who are the high harm networks, who are the ones that are really perpetrating the most significant offences? And then rather than trying to come from the point of view of picking up the pieces afterwards, working back from multiple victims and trying to work your way through a huge trawl of paperwork and documentation and huge amounts of data behind the curve, actually identify who the offenders are and then proactively target them in the same way that you would proactively target a very dangerous organised crime group smuggling huge amounts of drugs or carrying out murders and using firearms. And I think it's that's what you're sort of seeing there. Is the much more proactive, dynamic, covert, intelligence-led policing tactics being used to target the high harm fraud networks and fraud criminals. And I think that's a positive thing to see, because I think we know how extensive and prevalent fraud is, and just purely going at it from the point of view of prevention is massively important. Education, building in target hardening into banking systems, improving the public's awareness so they don't fall for those tricks. But ultimately, also not just looking at reactive investigations, but actually going proactively after the people that are responsible and in an intelligence-led strategy. I think that's what we're starting to see more of, which is a positive sign. That's my reflection on it.
Couldn't agree more. And I think had the police acted more sort of reactively rather than proactive, I don't think I'd have probably got some indication. I mean, there were markers that indicated me that something was going wrong. So a few weeks before I was arrested, there was a CIFAS marker placed on all of my bank accounts, and they're all frozen. In hindsight, I was thinking that's probably the time to go to Dubai. But as we talked before, I didn't, because I've got family ties in the
or any
UK,
other jurisdiction.
And were it not for the voice recording, I'd have probably contested the matter and gone to trial. Because this was before the turning point where I realised the impact that I'd caused on this guy. But I think had because this was the sort of smoking gun, and the police very cleverly to prove that was my voice on that phone call, despite the evidence from the bank saying yes, a match. They then obtained because I was on remand in prison. They obtained a recording of me speaking to my mum on the prison phone from the prison, and then used that as a control, and then got a voice expert to analyse and come up with sort of a voice DNA report and say, yes, there's a very strong likelihood that that's the same person. So that was the smoking gun. Now, in this climate now, we've got stuff like deepfake, for example. If I deployed deepfake, that voice wouldn't have been detected. That voice sample wouldn't have been detected. So I don't really. I mean, it would have made the police's job a lot harder, and it would have bought me a lot more time.
There is always somewhat of an arms race going on here between innovation, if you want to use that language, by
Yeah.
bad actors,
Yeah.
and especially involving technology. This is now.
Yeah.
And the work that's being done by those seeking to protect, whether it like be banks or financial services, or whether it be law enforcement or other organisations and agencies. And I just feel that we're in an age of contested technology and the exploitation of technology between those two, and we see that in other disciplines as well. But I just think that's an interesting, and it feels like an ongoing situation that we're in.
Perhaps we could get to conclusions now. So, a final part of all of our podcasts is we ask our guests to transport themselves to 2030 and to give a quick view of the world as they see it. What are the threats? What's the landscape looking like? What do we need to look out for?
Shall I go first? Yeah. So, I think if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, even if we look at the last 2 years, how we've developed AI, for example, and how AI is, in fraud, it's enabling the zero touch. I say is it's sort of zero touch perpetration of cyber-enabled fraud. It's enabling a bad actor to, rather than having their voice, for example, on the phone line, to deepfake that. It's enabling fraud to be committed from start to finish using AI, using deep learning models. So if we think about that, then that means that we can commit multiple frauds simultaneously. So you could, for example, see a future where a bad actor could commit 1,000 frauds simultaneously. So that's a real
to the extent of your, you talked about your this relationship you build with a victim, particularly your modus operandi in particular. That's challenging. If I think about natural language and chatbots and stuff, it's not quite at that level, is it?
It's not.
But you can see how it could get there.
You could see how it could get there. So, certainly, if I was programming a deep learning model, I could program it with I could go and get transcripts from court hearings, and I could input that in. I could educate the model to come up with the perfect fraud script, right? The script that 9 times out of 10 is going to result in a victim losing a lot of money. And I think, if I think of, back, certain phone calls, I made mistakes, and there's things which with the right training of an AI model could iron that out and make fraud a lot more successul.
Or I guess the other angle is it helps you with that 80%, leaving you with the high value. This is what we always say, isn't it? Oh yeah, I can automate the mundane and leave you to the high value.
Totally. Yeah.
There's a parallel, isn't there?
Absolutely.
Get you through the door to the vulnerable people, and then leave you to, the criminal, if you like, to do that last bit.
Absolutely. So I think looking, and we don't have to look 10 years ahead for this. We can look 18 months. If we think how far AI has come. I was talking to somebody the other day at a cyber conference I was speaking at, and he was saying that 5 years ago we expected the metaverse really to be the next big thing. AI probably wouldn't, and those two things have reversed. So AI is now really taking over the metaverse as sort of falling by the wayside. So it's really hard to predict, but I think hopefully we're going to see a future where AI is able to really, really help us to prevent fraud. But the problem is, unless the models that are trying to prevent fraud are programmed such that they really take account of the fraud mindset, they understand how a fraudster's thinking, what a fraudster might, how it might react to a certain disruption method being put in place, how light on their feet they are. Unless that's embedded, it's going to be really, really difficult to compete against the criminal use of AI. Yeah,
quite. Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Matt. You've given your 2030 view on previous podcasts, so perhaps unless you're particularly keen to give one in this context.
I think just we talked about the international dimension, and I just feel the other aspect, apart from the technology, which we will need to keep our eye on and will be massive, it just feels to me like that more broadly in a contested international geopolitical landscape where we don't seem to be seeing cohesion improving or cooperation. We seem to be seeing more fragmentation and more friction and more competition, and that as I think I have probably said before, is a breeding ground in which you create grey areas and spaces in which people can take advantage, whether it's to launder the funds, whether it's to operate from safe locations, to target the UK with cyber frauds or citizens of this country. So I just think that alongside the technology, the geopolitics and the implications of that state competition and the challenges around good collaborative work, and because all of this for me often where these offences are across multiple jurisdictions, the only way to deal with it is international partnerships and collaboration. So anything that can interfere with that will also be a challenge as much as the technology will be going forward.
Quite right. Well, thank you very much to both Matt and to Alex. That was really genuinely eye-opening. So thank you very much for coming all the way to Bristol to do it.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drowan. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drowan, signing off. Thanks for listening.